Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of How to Build a Game Studio. This week I get to talk to Carl Quo from Ghostly Bear Games, and it was a great conversation about his time in the industry and where he came from and how he built himself up before building his own studio. And then we get into him building a studio and the cool things that they're doing over at Ghostly Bear Games. So I encourage you now, even right now, as you're listening, go subscribe or follow their Twitch channel, twitch.tv/ghostlybeargames. Also, they have a Patreon, patreon.com/ghostlybeargames, where you follow them on Twitter at ghostlybeargame without the S because of Twitter character limits. But I literally could have talked to Carl all day for hours, but I didn't know if everybody would want a 5-hour podcast. So we sat down with an hour for him. I'm definitely going to have him on again once they're further along in the game and once they've released on early access. So yeah, have a listen. This was a great conversation between me and Carl. All right, everybody. I am joined today by Mr. Carl Quo. He is working at Ghostly Bear Games. They're an independent studio that's working on, I see you have a couple titles, but it seems like you're pretty much working on In Search of a Home right now?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, Carl, being an independent game developer, how did you get started in games in the first place?
So originally, the way I tell the story is that somewhere in the 5th or 6th grade, I started answering the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? That I wanted to work in games. And my answer never changed after that. And so during college, I had been looking into what does it take to get in the game industry? What does it take to make games? What I had wanted to do in the game industry had changed a little bit, but I went into college and went and got a computer science degree because that seemed the most straightforward path. And during college, I got involved with a tabletop game company in Seattle called Sabretooth Games, doing some playtesting because I was a big fan of collectible card games. And after I graduated, I was looking for work, and I had a part-time job at Gas Powered, doing some QA stuff there very briefly. And then I got a part-time job with Sabretooth doing various things that they needed. And that turned into a full-time job. And then that turned into my first job in the industry. It was kind of not super well planned, but also a direct result of trying to get in the game industry for most of my life. So
You said that you got into the games industry in a way that you didn't initially expect to. What did you want to initially do in the industry when you were a kid?
when I was a kid, I think I wanted to be a writer. When I was much younger, I was more into the English side of things, and writing and creative writing and all that. And then during high school, probably if you talk to literally any of my high school teachers, especially the math teachers, and told them I had graduated with a computer science degree, they would look at you like you were some sort of robot or alien. Because I had really good grades in English and really terrible grades in math. But during that time, I was reading a bunch of early articles and information about how to get into the industry. And there was a guy that I can't even remember his name anymore, who worked at Raven Software, who was like, there are no jobs in the industry except for engineering and art. And so if you want to get in the industry, either be an engineer or be an artist. And I was like, well, guess I'm going to be an engineer because I definitely don't have art skills. And so going into college, I totally refocused all my time and effort into engineering. And so the original plan was writer, the secondary plan was engineer, got into college, got 2 years into a computer science degree and realized I hate debugging, which if you talk to any engineer, they'll tell you that's basically what engineering is debugging. And so I was like, well, this is going poorly. And then I ended up graduating from college by I call it by producing my computer science degree. So the last 2 years of classes where I went to school were almost all group projects. Like there were tests on the theory, and you had to like write pseudocode on the theory, but you never had to submit code unless it was a group project because it was just trying to teach you how to work with a group and do larger scale projects. And so every time I would get into group, I made the same agreement. I will write every piece of documentation. I will give every presentation. I will do anything as long as you don't make me write a line of code. And it was a small enough school where everyone knew exactly what my coding skills were at. And all of them, being stereotypical engineers, hated writing documentation or giving presentations. And so that's what I did for my last 2 years of computer science projects was I gave presentations and I QA'd and I wrote documentation and got a computer science degree. And so going into the industry, I was looking for QA jobs because that seemed to be the path to become a producer. So that's why I did some contract QA at Gas Powered. And I was looking for some other stuff up in the Seattle area. But at the time, it just wasn't like it was hard to find that stuff. I think it was mostly the timing, like a bunch of stuff had just spun down. Um, and but Sabretooth needed stuff and it was a job that paid the rent. And so that's how I ended up there.
Interesting. I like how you turned your previous writing stuff into a positive that helped towards the other end because you again you were expected to you're expecting to be a writer at one point. So you just turned that all around and actually used it on the engineering side.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of my career has been rolling with the punches and figuring out how to take the things that I already know how to do and apply them to totally new contexts or totally new problems that I wasn't expecting. And it's worked out pretty good for me so far. I wouldn't call it a superpower, but it's something that I definitely had to learn how to do early, and has definitely come in handy more than once.
That's awesome. So after your first jobs in QA, where do you go from there?
So I was at Sabretooth doing literally like warehouse work and playtesting and naming cards for about a year, and then started to move more into production work there, doing design, helping to manage the handoff of cards from design to art production, where we would match them up with art and get them ready for printing and all that stuff. And then the company moved to Memphis. So Sabretooth Games was owned by Games Workshop. And after 2 years of working there, they wanted to relocate everyone to Memphis because that's where their U.S. headquarters was. And they were like, why are we paying all this rent money in Seattle? Why don't we just, we own this building in Memphis. We're going to relocate everyone there. And the plan was they also had a headquarters in Maryland at the time that they were also going to relocate to Memphis. And I think they have definitely done that since then. And so I was one of 8 folks who made the trip from Seattle to Memphis because I was, I think, 23 and I didn't have anything to lose, and moving across the country seemed like a cool adventure. And so when we got to Memphis, I ended up doing a ton of project management / production work for a Lord of the Rings miniatures game, which was really fun. And then after doing that for about a year, I ended up doing the project management work for all the game lines, including a new game line that I helped launch there. And then from there, spent a year doing that, launched the game, got it up and running, was juggling all these card and miniature game projects. And 2 years in Memphis is a lot for a guy who grew up in San Diego and is very much used to the West Coast. And after 2 years of delicious barbecue and also lots of kind of latent racism, I decided I wanted to get back to the West Coast and ended up getting a job at PopCap Games in Seattle, which one of the folks who had worked at Sabretooth had ended up at PopCap. And so I had visited their offices and I had met a bunch of people up there. And so when I was ready to jump out, they happened to have a QA job open. And I moved up there to start working on computer games, which was sort of my goal for the next step of my career. I was like, okay, I've done tabletop games. Now I want to do computer games. And I got the web QA job up there. Within a year, I had sort of me and a college friend who was working there at the time had pitched a game to their internal studio and shown off this like little demo that we had made in our spare time because he was working in IT, I was working in web QA, and they were like, "Hey, you guys should actually just make games." And we strongly agreed with that sentiment. And so they moved us into the studio, him as a game developer and me as a game designer, which at PopCap meant half game design, half production. And then so I worked there for, oh my God, 5 years in total.
That's
So
that's uh that's a good chunk of time.
yeah, my career is sort of fun. I worked at Sabretooth for 4 years, PopCap for 5, and Riot for 6. So this current gig needs to last for 7, otherwise I break the streak. Uh,
So you just need to get bought in the seventh year or something, and or move on to something, make another new studio, and then run that one for 8 years.
exactly. We'll just keep it rolling for as long as we can.
Just keep the streak going. So at so PopCap, is that where you really started to pick up more as a video game producer as opposed to a actual like games in general? Because you did obviously board games and miniatures at Saber.
Yep. Yeah. So I did a lot of game production there. It was sort of split between web games and PC download games and iPad games towards the end. Well, iPhone and iPad games, I guess, iOS games. Um, and so, like, the first project I ended up working on was Bookworm Adventures for the web, which was sort of a web version of the game because they had released Bookworm Adventures 1 and it had done pretty decently for them. And they wanted to have, and that was a PC download only. And so they wanted to have a game that could be played on the website because that was a thing at the time. And so we worked on that, we released it, and then that team rolled directly into Bookworm Adventures 2. And that was the big PC download game that I worked on at PopCap that ended up taking 2.5 years to make, mostly because PopCap was really weird about timelines and budget and how they ran the studio. And so we sort of had unlimited time to make this game. And we did a bunch of fun, cool stuff. And in the middle there, I worked with the same artist and a contract programmer to do the Bejeweled and Peggle add-ons within WoW, kind of on a company whim, but it was super fun, and we released those. And then after that was done, I worked on Plants vs. Zombies for the iPad specifically because we were launching that game as one of the launch titles for the iPad. And so we needed to spin that around super quick, and they needed a producer who could do that. So I went from a project that needed to, like, had 2.5 years and no deadline to a game that had to be ported in 45 days. And it was estimated to be a 60-day project. So we figured out how to make that work. And in the middle of that, swap out one of the zombies because we couldn't use the thriller zombie anymore. And then after that was done, went to work on the initial prototyping for Plants vs. Zombies 2. But then once that project got sort of, there was a stage in PopCap where you did a lot of the initial prototyping of like, okay, what's fun? What are the new mechanics? What is the hook for this game? And then there's sort of a period where the game sort of moves from that state into full production state. And there's sometimes changeover in team and leadership at that point. And I swapped over where another producer took over it from there because of some of the things that they wanted to do around the mobile space and around free-to-play stuff that was becoming more and more of a thing. And I also, at the same time, from a career perspective, was like, hey, I've done, these games in this space in iPad and in iPhone and kind of the casual mid-core market. And I want to work on games that, I personally play a ton of and personally really enjoy. And so I had been looking and ended up getting a gig at Riot, because at the time I played an obscene amount of League of Legends, and ended up down in LA working on League.
So a question I have from being a producer before we get into the Riot part is, as a producer, what did you like more, the unlimited free time to be able to do whatever you want with a game, or how did you feel about being pressured and on a strict time schedule?
It's hard to say I like either or. I think they're very different mindsets. The completely open, there's no time pressure, I think isn't great in a lot of ways, because I think we spent a lot of time doing things that were super fun and we really enjoyed ourselves. And I feel like when I look at Bookworm Adventures 2, there's something about that game where it's like we implemented just about everything that was on our wish list of things to implement about this game. And so that's like a super fun thing to cross off. But at the same time, when you look at it from kind of the product side of it, which is more of what I think of as a producer, I'm like, this game shouldn't have taken 2.5 years to make. Right. And the value that we got out of special coding the dance battle chapter, where it's a bunch of very special animations and code to make that work, was it really worthwhile? As a game designer, as a I guess sort of playful creative, like I absolutely think it was worthwhile. From a product side, no, not really. Bookworm Adventures is a series that has a super solid fan base, but it's not a huge fan base. Turns out Spelling Words is not the biggest audience in the world. And so we probably could have done that for a lot less time and burn. And so I sort of prefer the projects that have a more clear scope or a more clear deadline. Plants vs. Zombies for the iPad was kind of crazy and was fun, but more in a like, it's fun in the way that Tetris is fun.
I gotcha.
And so like there's sort of this in between, and like it's always weird to me where I bring it out, but like the add-ons for WoW were kind of that great mix where we were intentionally scoping them to be, hey, what's the minimum amount of stuff to do to put these into WoW? Because we're not going to make any money off of them, so we don't want to like spend 1 billion hours doing it. But at the same time, it needs to be like, there needs to be a reason that we're doing them, and they need to feel official in a good way. And so it was these fun projects where you rode this line of like, what are the most impactful things that we can spend time on that make this feel super awesome and very PopCap, but without burning a bunch of money, because we're never going to make money on these. So I'm pretty proud of both of those and how they turned out and how they rode that line.
So you think it's good to have a balance, essentially? Yeah,
I mean, you should have. I think projects are best when you have to ruthlessly prioritize, because it really gets your brain to figure out and cut down to what are the most impactful things. And you don't want it to be where you have to ruthlessly prioritize down to the bare minimum, and so things feel unfinished. But you have to be in a position where you need to ruthlessly prioritize. Otherwise, you just stuff everything in and nothing stands out, right? Like you don't get that sense of like, oh, here's what the centerpiece was supposed to be, right?
Right. Yeah. You don't get that refinement.
Yeah.
That maybe you would get otherwise. That makes sense. So after PopCap, you move on to Riot. You were a big League of Legends fan. So how was your time at Riot?
It was good. Spent 3 years directly on League of Legends. I came in And we had a pretty nice ramp up period. They were just getting me involved in production and League of Legends in general. And I started working with the team that was working on Dominion at the time, because the guy who hired me in, he was the head of Dominion. Um, and then shortly thereafter, basically right at the end of my ramp up time, they were like, "Okay, cool. So we have your first project. We are doing this end of season one tournament. We're trying to really make League of Legends this, sort of competitive esport thing that we don't really know what it is because this was 2011, and the game's kind of painful to run tournaments with, and so we need you to make spectator mode so that we can, have tournaments and broadcast them without it being this, pain in the butt and potentially damaging the results." Because they had, like, pretty recently had a tournament where one of the spectator, because like the way they did spectating before spectator mode was they actually had a 6v6 version of the game hacked in, and the sixth player just used a special ability to make them invisible and invincible. Um,
Okay.
but because, like most great hacks, it didn't fully work, and there were a few champions that had global passive abilities, and so like in a game, someone accidentally picked uh, Janna that gave everyone extra move speed on that team, and so they had to remake the game, and it was stuff like that that was just making that whole process way more painful. And they're like, just make a spectator mode. Um, and so that was super fun. And that, I joined in April of 2011, and I got to work on spectator mode for the season one finals, which was in, I think, October, November, maybe. Um, and except that we had to write a full mode and a thing that League wasn't designed at all to do. And at the time, the code base was kind of a nightmare mess. Um, and so I got to do that. So it was more towards the Plants vs Zombies for iPad, do a 60-day project in 45 days kind of thing. But like there was still enough there where it's like, okay, what's really important for this tournament thing? Um, and at the time, like it was all hands on deck, but you still sort of had this idea like we're doing something crazy here, and Twitch. Well, at the time it was Justin TV, and League was mostly on owned3d.com, and like all this stuff was getting big, and you're like, wow, this is a really neat problem space. And so we shipped. We were live for the end of season one. It worked. It didn't crash. It seemed to go over pretty well, and then they were like, great, now ship it to players. And so that became the rest of 2011, and I think we launched it beginning of 2012. Um, and in between, like, I was also the producer on the end of season one Inside the Game rewards. So I'm to blame for the frames around the loading screen, player frames that haven't been at various times controversial. Um, but we were like, what's something cool we can do? So we put those in. Um, and then from spectator mode, I went to, after we shipped spectator mode, I started working on the player behavior team, which just had been spun up. Jeff Lynne had just joined the company, and they were spinning up this team, and they needed a producer. And so I started working with that group. And then after working on that for another year or so, I ended up leaving League, just because I had been heads down working on League for 3 years, and just needed a break, and ended up working on a weird project that they were doing inside the studio itself, that was trying to bring some of the development and production techniques of the developers to the back office. So traditionally in companies, your IT departments, your HR departments, your finance departments, and your which are generally called the back of the office departments, don't usually see eye to eye with like developers or front of office folks who are making product, because they work in completely different ways. And one tends to be more conservative and about risk management, whereas the other one is like creative and let's push stuff out. And so Mark Merrill who was at the time the president. He became co-CEO later, but at the time I believe he was a president. Had this idea of like, hey, if we bring some of these production techniques and the agile methodology and all this stuff to the back of office stuff, we can hopefully start having these two sets of teams see more eye to eye, have more alignment in how they work, have empathy for each other and all this kind of stuff, and potentially do stuff not just because you want to make it safe, but really take a production mindset towards the culture and the work environment of Riot. And he and I had worked really well together, and I was looking for a new thing, and he's like, why don't you do this? And I'm like, sure, why not? Mostly because at the time, I had been looking forward to like, okay, what am I going to do? Like, do I want to go and join an R&D project? What do I want to do? Is now the right time to leave Riot? When do I want to leave Riot? What do I want to do when I leave Riot? And I had been thinking about, hey, at some point I want to start my own studio. And this was basically a golden opportunity of like, go work with a bunch of people who know how to build a game company from the corporate side, that thing that you've never done.
It's really smart.
And learn from them, and also teach them how you do other things and work on the culture. And so I took the opportunity mostly because I was like, this is probably the best chance I'm ever going to get to learn a bunch of stuff about how to actually run a company that isn't product. And so I did that for 3 years, and then it just felt like the right time to move on and start a company. And so I did.
Wow. So essentially you learned how to build, how to, make and build a game studio by working at one of the biggest ones out there on the back end.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's worth clarifying that you don't really learn how to build a company that way, but you do learn a bunch of things about how things look when you get to a certain amount of a certain pace of operation and scale. And I think that those things, like a lot of times when companies scale, especially companies that scale quickly, like Riot scaled really fast. I was there for 6 years and I was employee 256-ish. And when I left, there were over 2,500 worldwide. So we're talking about a literal order of magnitude. You end up having a lot of the mistakes you make, or even not even mistakes, but inefficiencies or non-optimal choices you make early on, come back and just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and be the things that, down the line, you're just having huge amounts of pain with, even though they shouldn't necessarily be things you have huge amount of pain with, but you're stuck with exactly how you did it before because changing stuff can be hard, especially when you're moving fast. And so being able to see that and being able to think about it from the lens of like, well, how would we want to do it? What is the right way for us to do it based on our culture, based on our values, right? Gives you a really good perspective on like, oh, if I was starting from scratch and I had these thoughts, then I would have made these choices that would be different early on, because a lot of times the early on decisions, doing something suboptimal when you're 5 people is not that big of a deal if it becomes scalable at 10 people or 30 people or 50 people, right? And you plan on getting there, right? So that's more of what I learned rather than necessarily like, how do you start a company from scratch? Because I was, 7-8 years past when Riot was starting from scratch.
Right. Okay. So that'll take us to Ghostly Bear Games. So how did you build your game studio?
So I left Riot on. So I both started Riot and left Riot on April 1st, mostly for the memes. And then I spent the rest of 2017 talking to folks that I had known and worked with during my career about being co-founders, right? So I had read that, studios are really good when you have 2 founders. And it's this really bizarre game of like, there's reasons why investors don't like solo founders, and there's reasons why investors don't like 3 or more founders. And so like 2 is this magic number. And I was like, okay, so I need to go and find a co-founder, and that'd be good anyway, because I want someone, to work with that can help balance out my strengths and weaknesses with their own. And so I talked to probably 10 folks who I had known and had varying relationships with in those conversations. Some of them were a literal one coffee, and it was like, nope, that's not going to happen. To the longest one I think I talked to for 2 months on and off of like, hey, what if we did this? What if we did that? Just trying to find someone who sort of shared my ideas of what I wanted to start from a values perspective. I was really focused on wanting to build a company, right? Like I didn't have an idea for a game specifically that I'm like, this is the game that we're going to go and build and do. Like to be clear, I have a billion game ideas. I have more than I can ever do anything with in my lifetime, but it wasn't about a specific game. Like I didn't have my dream game that I'm going to go and make. It was more like, I want to build a company. I want to build something that creates multiple games. And so finding the right co-founder who matched up with those values and matched up with the strengths and weaknesses was a thing I was looking for. And it got to be about November 2017. And I'd given myself until December, basically, to say, like, either this is happening by December or go find a job, Carl. And a co-founder who I had been like super close with, who I thought it was going to happen, we had come up with this really great idea for a game. The strengths and weaknesses lined up. He dropped out because he just couldn't swing the time commitment and the risk. And it was just one of those things where when faced with the actual reality of it and really thinking about doing it, he was just like, oh, I can't pull this trigger. And I was so frustrated. I was like, this was real. I was so excited about this game. And I was like, you know what? I'm doing it. And so I found a lawyer, and I was like, let's make this company. I had done research into what kind of companies and the reasons for all the stuff. And I actually went back to a couple of the people who I talked about co-founding with, and who had said no because they couldn't deal with the risk, or they had families, and so they kind of needed income and stuff. I'm like, okay, so no longer talking about founding. What if I just hire you? And so I had gotten some initial investment from friends and family, mostly family. I also had saved up a bunch of money from the whole stuff with Tencent and Riot. And so I was like, we're pulling the trigger. We're doing this. I'm hiring some people who I've worked directly with, and we're going to go and prototype this game. And this is what we're going to do. And so we incorporated in November. I talked to 4 folks who I specifically wanted to bring on board. They all started on January 17th, and we went to town.
All right. So how many in total did you have? Starting out?
So including me, we were at 5.
5. And are you currently still at 5, or have you grown since then?
We are currently at 6. At one point, we were at 7. So we went up to 7 and then dropped back down to 6. So
okay.
we've had a little bit of turnover, which is pretty normal for startups. Over the course of the last year and a half or so that we've been together. So
yeah, that makes sense. Now that you've started your company, where do you go from there? I mean, you said you were prototyping a game. What kind of game did you have in mind at that point? Because you said before you had a ton of game ideas. Where do you pick one?
Yeah, so the game idea we went forward with was one that I had been really concepting with the last co-founder I was talking about. The funny thing is, like, we got maybe a month into prototyping, and I'm like, wait, this game is literally a summation of my entire career. So the quick pitch was, due to Warhammer, what Hearthstone did to Magic the Gathering. So take tabletop war games and make them much more accessible, digital-only ideas, and go to town with that. And it felt like a really cool idea. I had a lot of great thoughts on it from my time on tabletop stuff. Obviously, I knew how to do session-based PvP games and competitive games through Riot, as well as free-to-play games. And then I knew how to take hardcore ideas and make them much more accessible through PopCap. And so that's sort of what we embarked on. It ended up being called Ultra Tactics. And so we spent the first probably up until probably up until June this year working on it. So a year and a half ish working on that. And the idea from the outset was we had friends and family funding, but we were going to need a lot more to do a service-based game.
Hmm.
And so we started down the path of like, let's prototype this, let's get it into a playable state so that we can go and get investment. And what does that investment look like? We're not sure exactly at the outset. We sort of aligned more towards a publisher. And so we built that pitch prototype. We had gameplay locked um, more or less by June or July of last year. And then we were getting it up to a polished state because we were working with some agents to help us pitch it to a bunch of publishers. We had sort of started talking to some publishers at E3, and the overwhelming consensus was like, hey, this looks really early, which was basically like, hey, you're using gray boxes and super placeholdery stuff, and we can't tell what your vision of the game from an art perspective is going to look like, so get it there. And so then we spent the summer and the winter, fall and winter, getting that all up to speed. And then we did a huge pitch round the beginning of this year, where you go to Dice. We went to GDC, we went to E3, and pitched our faces off, and then basically no everyone passed on it. For a variety of reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit in the call. And then we pivoted to what we're working on now, which is In Search of a Home, which is something we're going to go a little bit more self-published early access route, very early access route, in fact. And that's a case of we want to stay together. Taking Ultra Tactics all the way through self-publishing would be a lot of money that we don't have the runway for.
Hmm.
And so we're putting that one on hold, working on something smaller scope that's more reasonable for us to do with the people and time we have, and try to get engagement with that one. And assuming everything goes well, then we can take, once that gets out and fully released, and we can take the revenue from that and push it towards getting Ultra Tactics up and out. So.
Okay, so In Search of a Home is a way for you to basically gain some capital, so that way you can keep working on Ultra Tactics.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I was going to actually ask, especially after having these pitches now. Obviously, you don't have a game out there that's making money for you. How are you going to expect to bring in to keep a studio full of people sustained?
Yep. I mean, I've been crazy. The way I say it is, I've been crazy fortunate in life,
Hmm.
incredibly lucky, and so between my savings account and my investment from friends and family, I've been able to keep going for a year and a half. And we have runway through till November, so we have time to get In Search of a Home up and out, and hopefully generate some resonance and some revenue from it. But it's like, yeah, that's the ticking of the runway is constantly in the back of my head. And so like without the support I've had from my family, like we wouldn't be here. So
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine. I mean, we're working on a game too, so it's definitely stressful, and I can relate to that extent. But I mean, we have runway of a little bit of time, but so yeah, I can definitely see where that is a big factor. But why don't you think Alter Tactics got picked up?
so the overwhelming feedback we got was that almost every so when you pitch, you get some fast no's and some slow no's. In all cases, the no's that we got back was we like the team, we just don't see a fit with the game. And there were people who said we don't see a fit with the game because it didn't make sense for them as publishers, right? Like it's a free to play PvP session based game. There's actually not that many publishers who feel super comfortable with free to play. There's and I think they've been burned by people who say they want to do free to play and maybe don't know free to play very well, or they don't have internal specialty around free to play stuff. So, as an example, one of the publishers we talked to was Private Division, and Private Division they haven't like they have a bunch of games that they haven't announced, but like none of the games that they've announced have a free to play content to them, right? And it feels like they're focused more on premium style games at sort of the ex AAA now indie developer size, right? And we knew that going in. Like we had looked at their portfolio, we looked at who they had, and we're like, this is what they're aiming for. But maybe we can be their team that would come in and be free to play, and they would want to support us. And that was an honest conversation we had with them, where they were like, hey, the risk we have with you, like we think your team's really cool, but you're free to play, and we don't know if we have the team to support that yet. And so there were a bunch of no's that we got because of that. And then from the people who could support free to play, we got some no's around the idea being that they didn't understand the market play, which is an easy way to say they thought the market was too small. And that's complicated because clearly, as the founder, I strongly disagree with them, because we were making a market expansion argument. We were like, hey, there's a lot of untapped market here. And so if you come out with this game, there's so many people you can get. The challenge there is like when you're making that play, you're sort of, it's a gamble because they can look at the market that exists. They can look at your argument for how you would expand that market. And then they basically say, do we believe what percentage of that market would turn into something else? And a lot of them just ended up saying like, hey, we just don't think this gets big enough to justify doing it. And that is frustrating for a lot of reasons. But, at the same time, there's not really anything to do other than go, okay, I totally hear you. We changed it during our pitches. We changed how we were presenting the market data a few times. We tried to get more data. But as an independent game developer, it's also super hard to get data. There's not tons and tons of data out there, especially now that Steam Spy kind of got kneecapped.
And the games industry in general is notoriously secretive.
Yep. And so it's one of those things where this is a game that just kind of needs to be self-published. And I think that there's a likelihood that a lot of free-to-play games probably need to go into a self-publishing mindset. This is something that Dauntless did, and I'm friends with the folks over at Dauntless, and they talked about having very similar problems of talking to publishers early on and not seeing the market play, not fully understanding it, which is a lot of why they went self-published to begin with. It has its own crazy pitfalls going self-published, and is definitely riskier in a bunch of ways, which is why we were trying to get a publisher. But the market argument, especially around free-to-play games, I think is something that ends up falling in favor of self-publishing.
Okay, so you go from this where you have a game that the publishers just don't really want to do. So at what point do you know that you have to transition to a different project?
We knew around E3 that things weren't looking great. We basically had gotten no's from everyone except for two potential publishers who were excited by the idea and interested, but we're still sort of talking it over. And so we had hopes, but things were like, the longer it went out, the more we were like, the longer this goes, the higher chance this becomes a no, and the more painful that will be, right? And so we had just finished a big milestone of pre-production on Altered Tactics, because we had been doing pre-production while we waited for all these pitches to go and just kept the project moving forward. And so we had sort of said, okay, we're going to do a game jam, as a sort of interstitial half sprint in between after this milestone, just to blow off steam, have some fun, work on something else, just give our brains a break. And right before the game jam, I was like, hey, look, so this is where we're at. we should probably evaluate what we want to do in this game jam, not just as a let's have fun and do something different, but as something specifically smaller scope and different that we could potentially take to market if we really like working on it. Otherwise, we probably need to go into a rapid prototyping phase on a few other ideas after we're done with this game jam. And so we went through the game jam. We ended up working on the initial prototype of In Search of a Home, which had actually been a game that me and Anthony had been talking about in our spare time for years at this point. And the team really jived on the idea. It was by far the idea across the board that everyone was most excited about from our giant folder of Game 2 ideas. And it was of a scope that we thought we could do. We got a couple key pieces of inspiration while we were just game jamming on it that were like, yep, this is the one. And so basically, I think it was like the week after E3, we had full on pivoted to starting to work on In Search of a Home and just started grinding on that. And we just finished the second formal sprint. So it's been probably about 5 or 6 weeks that we've been working on the game.
Okay. And you so with this you guys decided to go the early access route with it.
Yep.
When did you make that decision?
I think pretty early on. The initial evaluation was, what does going early access with Ultra Tactics look like? Can we pivot our pre-production basically into a sort of founders release, super early access, closed alpha kind of thing? And so we had sort of already gone to like, okay, what does self-publishing look? Because like the idea of going through another pitch cycle would be really rough, and we don't really have the time. Pitch cycle tends to run, it isn't a hard and fast rule, but it tends to run from basically the beginning of the year through to E3. So the idea being that most pitches happen at DICE and at GDC, and then you pretty much are having follow-up, wrap-up meetings at E3 and either starting contract negotiations or it's not happening, because by the time E3 rolls around, most publishers sort of want to be in the deals that they want to make, and so they kind of have all their money allocated and they don't have a lot to sort of make deals on the back half of the year. Again, like not hard and fast rule, you can sort of have it happen, but the vast majority sort of lines up to the beginning of the year. And so if we spun In Search of a Home to try and find a publisher, one, like it's a much smaller game, and so that would actually be hard to pitch for a variety of reasons, just team size to what they think they could get out of it, all that kind of stuff. We'd be having to get it to a pitch ready status in a super short amount of time and then go and pitch it, and pitching takes a pretty big of investment of time, especially when publishers aren't all in one place like they are for GDC or E3. And then you'd sort of have to wait around again and hopefully get someone to say yes, but who knows how long it'll take. And the general guidance is like, it's going to be 6 to 9 months from the moment you start pitching to a deal being signed, if you get a deal. And just looking at the runway, it's like, okay, none of this is tenable. Like none of this is going to work at all. And so it was pretty much like, okay, we have to go more of an early access route. How do we do whatever we're going to do in an early access round? And that's part of the reason why we even prototyped In Search of a Home, was we're like, it was one of the ideas that it's like, this is pretty compatible for a early access style release. And it seems much more, I don't want to say less risky, but it's like less of a binary risk than doing Ultra Tactics in early access. The way I framed it for the team at one point was, doing Ultra Tactics in early access and going for the Founders Pack is like putting it all on black. Maybe, like there's a chance. But there's also a chance that we just basically immediately fold, right?
Yeah. So maybe the right people see it and it takes off, or maybe nobody pays attention and it's done.
Yeah, and you have to hit it like all or nothing, kind of big, in order to get enough people and enough revenue to sustain what Ultra Tactics needed to be a successful project. Whereas doing doing In Search of a Home is a little bit closer to trying to play blackjack in a smart way. You can still, lose all your money, right? Like it's still
Right.
gambling, but you have more chances to react. You have more chances to figure things out. You have a better chance of seeing the like, oh, we're gonna run out of money coming your way, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the team, several members of the team have families. I want to make sure that they have a level of security around that and health insurance, so we can see the end coming and make sure that everyone goes into it with all this kind of stuff. And so we're making that play because it gives us more room to maneuver, which I think gives us a higher chance of success, and it it mitigates the risk such that we're still having the same amount of risk, but we see the end coming if it's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So you can prepare for it if you
Exactly.
have to. Yeah.
Yep.
That's a great decision. I think it's a smart choice for you and for everybody that works for your company. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I would agree with that. So, early access. Have you guys actually released an early access yet, or?
No. So we're doing some weird stuff. Well, I guess I don't know if it's weird. I think it's weird because it feels weird to me. Um, so we're actually doing two fronts. We are launching the game into like even earlier access than early access, and starting to build a playtest group.
Mm-hmm.
And we're using itch.io as sort of the way to deliver the game. We already have builds going to itch.io and nightly builds going to itch.io. It's a little bit locked down at the moment because we're still getting the core loop up and running. But we're doing that, and really we're about to open the floodgates. So this podcast is oddly well timed to try and get a core playtest group in order to sort of start tuning the game and get it ready for a Steam early access release, with the idea of going to Steam early access probably sometime in September. Uh, and concurrent to that, we're about to launch. It's technically already live. We've been hesitant to push people to it because we're still getting everything up and running, but we're
Mm-hmm.
also launching a Patreon that is more about sort of behind the scenes game development. So we're streaming our daily stand-ups on Twitch. We're going to be putting up videos and not really podcasts, but sort of like content of some of our meetings and stuff, so people can get a real good feel of like what does it actually take to build a game and what are the conversations you're having. Sort of the pitch is like, hey, if you thought GDC talks were a little bit too curated, like we're we're going to show it to you raw and unfiltered,
Yeah.
and really try to build a community. One of the core pillars of what I want to do with the company in general is about building communities around games and
Mm-hmm.
and game development. And so this is sort of an extension of that. Of like, if we're going to be doing this, let's do it in a way that builds community, creates a sense of belonging, maybe helps some people who want to learn more about game development in a real tactical sense. And if Patreon ends up paying for the hours we spend editing videos, like,
Mm-hmm.
great, this is awesome, right? And hopefully it builds a community where we have a bunch of playtesters that we can bounce ideas off of and help seed the success of In Search of a Home long term, because they get to watch it and be invested in its development. And so it's part marketing exercise, part us trying to live our values, part Carl thinks this is an interesting idea and have been thinking about it for a while and so wanted to try it. Um, but yeah, so we're technically live on Patreon and coming to Steam Early Access in September. And if you join our Discord, which you can do regardless of Patreon status or not, you can get access to the game for the playtesting group. And yeah, it'll be a wild ride.
Yeah. No, I think what you're doing is awesome. Actually, like I'm really curious to see how well you guys do, because for us, Patreon's something we thought about and we're still thinking about, and that's part of the reason we're doing a podcast, is just so that people get to know us and kind of see our journey along the way. And in a sense, I mean, obviously we're not talking about everything, at least not quite at the level you guys are. That's why when I jumped into one of your stand-ups and I was like, wow,
Mm-hmm.
they just got everything out there. I'm like, okay, this is because just looking at your sprints and your and all that stuff, it just reminded me of ours. So
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was an interesting way to do it. So I'm definitely going to be paying attention to how you guys do, so we can kind of compare notes in a
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely. And I mean, I'm confident that at some point when we're having some design conversations or some level of curated content, we can bring you over and have you talk about your guys' process and stuff. And I think that's part of the interesting thing for me too, right? Like, because I got pinged on Twitter from one of my other friends in the industry who was like, "Oh yeah, I was watching your stand up and you do this thing really, really well, and it's something that I want to take into our stand ups." But I'm curious how it breaks when you go when you get into a ship cycle. And I'm like, yeah, well, I'm curious to see how it goes too. Like this is how we've done it before, and this doesn't change, but this does change. And it was a really good conversation with her about how we each approach game development. And I think that's something that when I was learning how to be in the industry and when I've watched GDC talks and when I've talked and mentored producers at Riot and at previous companies, it is this sort of how games get developed can be a bit of a black box. And every
Mm-hmm.
GDC talk or really great article you read, you're always like, okay, this is really cool. And then you start to try to implement and you're like, but wait, how does it work when you implement it? It's like that next tier of like, how does this actually work? Um, and so much of what I've been trying to do with the company and sort of what I've been advocating for really is about these cultural habits and details that are about literally how you talk about stories, not on a grand scheme, not on a like here's a planning process, but literally how you talk about stories every day in stand up that creates a habit, that creates a way of thinking that ends up hopefully paying dividends in the results. And that's super hard to see in a GDC talk or in an article. And so I'm hoping that doing this kind of stuff, that's the value and that's the cool perspective we provide to folks, that hopefully they love so much they want to pay us some money for it. Um, so and I think it's something that I haven't seen a lot of,
Yeah.
um, especially at a team size. Like I think you see a lot of folks on Twitch,
Mm.
um, like solo developers or one or two people development teams doing some work on there, or you see larger development teams doing like, okay, here's our 1 hour once a week art. We draw art on stream and answer some questions,
Mm-hmm.
and neither of those, is really the same thing. And so we're giving it a shot. It helps that I have zero sensitivity to putting stuff out there of like
Yeah.
what we're
Yeah.
working on. Um, there are things that we protect and we'll never stream, but
Mm-hmm.
it's funny because most of those have nothing to do with the game. Like I will never stream a retrospective, as an example, because I want the team to have a safe space to be able to speak their mind and say how things went for reals without worrying about how it comes across on stream. And so
Yeah.
like things like that will always be protected. But like whether or not how many ships we're working on, like that just bothers me less of having it out there. So um, I think if folks were working on a narrative game that was like super secret or like you didn't want to spoil it, it'd be harder. But
Yeah, that's kind of the situation we're in because we're working on a narrative RPG that, so we don't want to sit there and put out a ton of info that's going to spoil this or talk about exactly what we're doing
mhm.
right away. So it's also kind of hard to for us to do a podcast this early on because a lot of guys are just still doing engine work. So
Yep.
it's we're trying to think of other topics and ways to keep the podcast going, and that's why we like having other developers like yourself on because we get other perspectives and people just doing stuff in different ways.
Yeah, and I enjoy being on, and as a producer, I enjoy talking about myself endlessly. But I think that what I would sort of say to you is like, I wouldn't undervalue talking about things that you potentially think are a little bit boring or not as entertaining. Like, because engine work is a thing that a lot of game developers go through, and I think people roll their eyes at it or are like, oh, this is just grunt work or whatever. But like, I think there's a lot of folks who have, especially now that Unreal and Unity,
Hmm.
and Game Maker and all these things are out there and are being in use more. Like, I don't know that everyone really understands what goes into an engine, and so even if it feels a little bit draggy for you guys, like I think there's value there in talking about it that you can't see because you're so close to it, but there's lots
Right.
of people out there who might. who could get value out of it. And so don't be afraid to talk about that stuff. I don't disagree with the like make sure it's entertaining and get other people on board, but like I think it's easy for it. Like I always say, like who wants to hear a producer talk about stuff? But I've ended up talking to enough junior producers who are like, well, I'm actually looking for specifically this kind of thing. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a thing I would never think to talk about because I think it's so like not basic, but like it's a thing I just do, right? And it doesn't always occur to me that that's not a thing that everyone knows or not a thing that everyone does. And so I think that the more we can talk about that stuff and the more open we can be, I think it just levels up the industry as a whole. So
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. So I'm I'm really glad to have you on. So you said that you guys are launching in September for early access.
yeah, my goal is to get us on Steam Early Access mid-September. It may be late September because game development is hard, but
Yeah.
my goal is definitely September, which gives us like earlier into September is better because it gives us more time to try and earn runway.
Yeah.
Obviously, that is that is a big consideration, but we also want to make sure that we put our best foot forward that we can onto Steam Early Access. From a baseline perspective.
You want to make a good first impression.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because the more I've read and watched articles and GDC talks and all the stuff about how people have been selling games, especially indie games more recently, I think I'm less concerned with our first impression per se, and more it feels more and more like it's how well do you respond to feedback, how well do you continue to build the community, and how many times do people sort of start spreading the word about it.
Yeah.
And then when that word of mouth happens, that's each of those word of mouth spikes is going to be a bunch of first impressions, and so your quote unquote first impression is going to change a lot over time. But it's for me, it's like when you go out on Steam Early Access for the very first time, are you giving people a really clear idea of exactly what your hooks are, right? Like, is it super obvious when they sit down to play In Search of a Home exactly what we're trying to do? Because then if it's super obvious and they can articulate it really well without us having to give them a bunch of words, then that will drive the word of mouth, right? Even if we're not doing it the best we want to do it, as long as it's super clear. Like one of the touchstones that I've used for the team is like, if you look at Darkest Dungeon from the very first video they put out, right, it's like they're about an insanity system. They're about grinding these poor souls being ground to dust in this eldritch dungeon. They're about that narrator, right? Like these things are what people always talk about Darkest Dungeon. The very first build of Darkest Dungeon is not nearly as full featured as what it became, right? And there were, I'm sure, tons of bugs, like, or look at Slay the Spire, like tons of bugs and stuff early on. But like what the hook was super clear from the moment you saw it, and that's what's important. Even it can be buggy, it can be work in progress. As long as you're responding to feedback and it's clear that you're updating the game regularly, then there's a lot of forgiveness around what the state of the game is, as long as people can say, oh, it's exactly this.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now that we've talked a bunch about a game and haven't actually talked about the game, what is the game about?
So In Search of a Home is you lead the last fleet of your people in search of a home in space. It's a roguelike that takes the key pieces of FTL, right? Like how you sort of led that crew and going through space and going on this journey, and marries it with BSG, Battlestar Galactica, the newer TV show of like this ragtag fleet flying through the stars, trying to find a habitable planet, and all the ways that it goes wrong, not even external to the fleet, but internal to the fleet, like managing the politics of the military versus the religious fanatics versus all this kind of stuff, right? And I think that that's a lot of where the seed of the game came from. So it's really about putting the player in this position of you are leading the fleet and they are looking to you as a leader, and you have to guide these people who are terrified and hopeful and worried through the stars and keep them from starving and keep them from, you know, dying, and make the jumps till you find a habitable planet, right? And so that's really what the game is.
I mean, I'm interested to check that out. That's for sure. It seems like an interesting concept. It's not something I would have like thought of, but I
Yeah,
like the idea.
yeah. I think like a lot of it, like bluntly, FTL and BSG were basically the two key influencers. Me and my friend Anthony Coleman, who we went to college together. We worked at Sabretooth and PopCap together. Um, we talk about games all the time. We had both really enjoyed FTL. We both really loved Battlestar Galactica, and I think we were just hanging out in Seattle during a PAX a few years ago, and we were like, "Wait, what if instead of you're just flying a single ship, it's you're really controlling the fleet? Like, what is that?
Yeah.
Oh, and sort of went from there. And at various times, Cylons and sort of the idea of a threat or a pursuer has been important, has not been important. It's currently not as important. I sort of look at both Battlestar Galactica and Interstellar, and I'm like, both of those are runs of our game, right? Like
Yeah.
those are in a roguelike, those are two different seeds, runs through our game, and they're both completely valid. And so how do you build that out? How do you communicate that? And I think the biggest thing for me is I really want to make hopeful games. And so it's the interesting stylistic challenge I think here is we want the game to centrally be about hope. Like you're always jumping, hoping to find the next home. You are going through this world with hope for finding this next great planet that your people will thrive on. But at the same time, it's kind of a survival. There's an attrition. There's always this sort of force pulling you down. And so how do you keep the game about hope versus being more cynical or nihilistic? And so it's like you have hope, but what will you have to sacrifice for your next jump is kind of the tone we're going for. And that's a interesting balance to strike.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds really, really cool. In all honesty, like hearing the pitch like that, I'm like, yeah, like because I loved FTL, and then so like everything you're talking is like, I'm like, this sounds like a game for me.
Well, I hope it's a game for lots of people for a variety of reasons. But yeah, it's one that we're super excited by, and I think it is in a genre that I think a lot of people have enjoyed. Like I think a lot of people love FTL and sort of the newer cast of roguelikes in that vein. I think it pulls a little bit on some of the same things that some of the more like non-combat-y survival games have pulled on, like Oxygen Not Included, which I've been playing a billion hours of, or Frostpunk, or some of these things. And so, like, I think it's pulling on a few strands, but then hopefully weaving it together in a metaphor and an experience that's hasn't really been seen. I don't think a lot of games put you in a true sense of leadership, and sort of managing a fleet, not from a standpoint necessarily of like flying each of the ships or like controlling all the control panels, but like part of our game is managing the personalities. Like, who are the ship captains? What do they believe? How does that align with how you're managing the fleet, right? Like, one of the things we want is you end up pissing off enough people, they might just all get onto one ship and jump off, right? Like, you could lose a ship out of the fleet because they disagree with what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, like when you look at BSG and, you find the Pegasus, it's like, oh my gosh, there's this super awesome moment where your fleet gets bigger because you found another remnant population, and that's amazing. But they're all authoritarians. They're all incredibly militaristic authoritarians, and you're not managing that way. And like, what do you do? Like, now this is your fleet, and how are you managing all these humans, right? So
Yeah, I think there's a lot for you to do there, so I can see where early access makes sense because it seems like you could add a ton of different scenarios, so to speak, into that.
yeah.
So have you guys discussed a price point for early access?
For early access specifically, no. I mean, I think that we were looking at a lot of the games in this kind of genre, like Darkest Dungeon and FTL and Into the
Mm,
Breach and all this kind of stuff. And it seems like $20 to $25 is pretty common. It also seems pretty common to start at a lower price and then go up once you're out of early access. And so we're sort of targeting around there. But one of the things that I always try to keep a sense on is like, what things have come before are good information, but you also have to look at what's out the minute you go live, right? And so
hmm
what are we up against? So I would probably say we're targeting that, but sort of what do we see on the market at the time, and what sort of makes sense for where we're at? I would imagine we do start cheaper when we feel like the game is not as much of a um, value proposition, and then going up as we add content and as we add complexity, right? Also, as sort of like you see it as the reward for people who jump in earlier, get it for a little bit cheaper, and then it goes up over time. So we'll probably follow a curve similar to that as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait to check it out once it's out there.
Yeah, for sure. And like, well, as I said, we're definitely streaming probably more than we should in some ways, but like it's been super fun. So like people can always check in on development and see the game where it's at on our Twitch channel. Or if they feel like following along at a deeper level, the Patreon is there. So there's a lot of ways for folks who are interested in the game to get involved. So it should be good.
Awesome. So as far as building your own game studio,
Mm-hmm.
Carl, what's one piece of advice you would give someone that's just about to embark on forming their own studio?
Oh, geez, one piece of advice. Uh, so the thing that I would normally say is that the biggest skill you need to develop is the ability to roll with the punches, because there's going to be a lot of them, and they're going to come
Mm-hmm.
from literally everywhere. And then part of this is like it's something that I think I'm good at, and so I end up talking about it a lot. But like the number of times we've had to pivot and change courses in small ways and big ways is pretty huge. And part of the thing that I'm able to do as a leader, and that is super important for me to do as a leader, is to do that confidently and sort of emotionally lead the team through that, right? Because not everyone on my team is as good with ambiguity or changing directions, right? And so coaching them through, hey, yes, we just got told no by a bunch of people, but that's okay. We're rolling with that punch. Here's what we do next, right? Like, don't wallow in it. Don't succumb to that anxiety, right? And so you yourself have to be super good at that, because you're going to be leading whatever size of team you are through that. Um, and so that's probably the biggest piece of advice that I would give, and the most important. The bonus piece of advice that I will give you is uh, you will be living with so much anxiety in your life that you have no idea. And so finding a way to manage that for yourself as a leader is super important. I go to the beach. It's a good thing because I live in SoCal, and so I am about 5 miles from the beach. And when I get stressed out, I go to the beach, and just the sound of waves crashing reduces my anxiety level in half, at least, usually. And so if on a day all I can hear is the runway clock in the back of my brain and I'm just stressed out, I just take the time to go to the beach to center myself, because if I don't do that, then all of that anxiety is going to pass along to every member of the team, and they're going to start freaking out, and it's just a terrible cascade effect. So that's the bonus advice I have for people.
No, that makes a lot of sense. You have to have something that helps to keep you sane. That's for
Mm-hmm.
sure. So, Carl, where can everybody find out about your games, your company? What are your Twitch channels and everything?
Yep. So pretty much everything we have is slash Ghostly Bear Games. So twitch.tv slash Ghostly Bear Games, Patreon slash Ghostly Bear Games. That's Instagram. The only one that's different is Twitter, where it's Ghostly Bear Game, because character limits.
Mm.
And then if you want to check out the game specifically, in searchofahome.com.
All right, awesome. Well, Carl, I want to thank you for being on. We'll definitely have you on again as you get, because I want to hear more about as you're going through early access and stuff after you guys launch. Like I think that'll be interesting to hear all that. So
Yeah, I'd love to be on again. I'm super glad you had me on this time. Thank you so much. It's been super fun. So.
Awesome. Thank you. And that's this week's episode. Again, thanks to Carl for coming on. We'll definitely have him back. I want to talk to him about the progress they've made once we get to that point when we talk to him in a few months down the line, just to see how they're doing, how the studio's doing, all that kind of stuff. And again, thank you everybody out there listening. We appreciate your support. We appreciate you downloading the podcast each and every week. It's doing a lot better than we ever expected or hoped that it would do, and we're very proud of that. And hopefully that you're enjoying the content that we're throwing out there too, that you're enjoying the interviews. We're hoping to secure more, and I'm working on that as we get closer and closer to the time of the year where devs are probably going to hunker down and release some games. So we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, if you have any questions for us, again, feel free to email us at socialmedia@winterborngames.com. And we'll, if we get enough questions, we'll maybe do some listener mail segments in the future. And if you're a game dev and want to come on the show, email us as well, because we'd love to have you and talk to you about your experience creating your own game studio. Because I think everybody has a little bit of a different experience, and everybody has a different approach on how they get into it. So we'd like to hear from you about yours. So yeah, definitely get in touch with us, and we'll be here. You can follow us everywhere on social media at Winterborn Games. I was way too diligent about that for it to happen otherwise. And that's it. Thank you guys for listening.